On June 1st, 2020, Army Times published a story titled "Two Army Training Sites Had 210 Combined COVID-19 Cases After Recruits Left Controlled Monitoring Phases." For those familiar with military operations, this would be just short of a military training company-sized element, or 1/3 of a training battalion, one of which was located in Fort Benning, the home of the infantry, where male soldiers, many freshly graduated from high school, and primarily between the ages of 17 and 20, for 22 weeks, up from 14 weeks prior to 2019, are trained proceeding through graduated levels of control, identified as red, white, and blue at graduation for military service in the infantry, our ground combat force. While since 2019, infantry training for females has begun at Fort Pickett for the National Guard, Infantry 1 Station Unit training at Fort Benning remains what has been often called the Benning School for Boys. The other involved Army training installation was Fort Leonard Wood, where male and female soldiers, again, most just graduated from high school, or at least many, between the ages of 17 to 35, with an average age of just below 21. Contrasting with the fact, according to a recent Military Times report, that the average age of young men dying in combat has actually decreased substantially from the mid-20s in earlier wars, like Vietnam, where the average age of a soldier killed in action was 23, to the late teens today, in a military where, since Vietnam, the average age of enlisted and officers has increased, according to Pew Research, by at least 2 years. Begin their coeducationally integrated basic training for 8 weeks, formerly 9 weeks, before continuing on the job, on to their job specialty training. According to their official website, Fort Leonard Wood is a thriving and prosperous installation that has evolved from a small basic training post more than 75 years ago to a premier Army center of excellence that trains more than 80,000 military and civilians each year. In my last years in the reserves, that was where I went out for annual training to conduct basic training as a basic training company commander. I am very, very familiar with Fort Leonard Wood and the trainees that are there. It is the largest basic training post in the country, from a total of 4, which includes Fort Benning, where I began military service for infantry, Fort Jackson, where I've also been, and Fort Sill, which also has 1 station unit training for field artillery. And Fort Leonard Wood is also the home for combat engineer training, as well as military police. And St. Louis, the largest city in proximity, is 135 miles or 2 hours away by automobile, causing soldiers to call it Fort Lost in the Woods. And with school being suspended since Easter because of a pandemic crisis, kids who don't want to return, whose schools don't want to return in September because of fear they might incur liability and outbreak, definitely in these unique cases did not contract a novel coronavirus at a high school graduation ceremony that was not held, or even in a church or choir rehearsal, despite the fact that the military is the largest demographic devoted still to faith. So how in the world were 210 new recruits, or 1/6, infected from over 1,200 at 2 major military training installations for the nation's largest ground force? Beyond an increasing age among military recruits and devotion to religion, one of the factors among the demographic metrics for new recruits includes their affluence, most coming from the middle class, and most coming from Texas, California, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, New York, Ohio, and Virginia, making the Southeast the primary region from where recruits come to military service in what has become called a family business for most. finding most recruits following the footsteps of some close relative who served before them, dating back even before a civil war. Moreover, this is a very select demographic amongst all Americans because by reason of education, physical fitness, and criminal record, over 75% of age-eligible Americans are not qualified to begin Army training. And of that remaining 25% who can, only less than 1% are inclined to do so. As of June 30th, 2020, according to the CDC and updated guidance, the incubation period for COVID-19 is thought to extend to 14 days, with a median time of 4 to 5 days from exposure to symptoms onset. 4 to 5 days from exposure to symptoms onset. One study reported that 97.5% of persons with COVID-19 who develop symptoms will do so within 11.5 days of SARS-CoV-2 infection. Hence, these two isolated incidents provide a lot of data about exactly how the virus infects, especially because it must be assumed that anyone introducing the virus to two major training installations had to, of necessity, contract an infection from a novel coronavirus on average 4 to 5 days before departing for basic training, or on average 11.5 days before shipping off for training. Is it peculiar in the least that of 1,200 young people in America doing whatever they did in hiatus from school and work and everything else, that one-sixth, just days before beginning military training, just happened to contract a pathogen which seems like a high incidence of infection for this population that should have been replicated in others within their age cohort. Anyone familiar with military combat training is very aware that the textbook definition of an ambush begins by canalizing a maneuver element into restricted corridors, proceeds to lure that combat force into a cul-de-sac to culminate with engagement with enfilade fires from small arms weapons placed at a location of tactical advantage. And in this instance, anyone planning an ambush certainly was well aware of the travel route that each and every one of these newly enlisted soldiers would take before arrival at training at least 2 weeks before they reported to a MEP station to receive their travel tickets, take a quick medical exam, repeat their oaths of enlistment, and begin travel to Fort Leonard Wood or Fort Benning. Normally, beginning with an Army recruiter showing up at their doorstep to begin positive control the day before, to take them to a hotel at a remote location but close enough to the MEP station for beginning processing the next morning and departure to their training installation. During travel, they have freedom and mobility, but as soon as they hit that airport, they are under complete, positive military control. Or a perfect place for an ambush, especially in light of the new findings that suggest that a novel coronavirus was the product of an in vitro culture in a virology lab in Wuhan, known to be conducting research on bat coronaviruses with security problems dating back to at least 2018. A lab where the military from the Communist People's Republic of China was placed in charge after the outbreak. But let's dismiss this as a possibility for a second to review other possible sources of infection. Are the tests producing false positives? Any reports have indicated that the current tests are not even accurate. This is very possible and consistent with other aspects of the pandemic crisis, including the admitted usage of facial coverings to compel compliance, inspire fear, and serve as a constant reminder signal of an alleged danger requiring all to stay at home, close the states again until it all goes away. According to the Army Times report, health professionals at Fort Leonard Wood first screened and tested about 500 soldiers and trainees assigned to 1st Battalion, 48th Infantry Regiment upon their arrival, according to officials there. All test results were negative, and they then began the 14-day monitoring phase. 4 days after the end of the group's controlled monitoring phase, a trainee reported to Harper In-Processing Health Screening Facility with symptoms, and immediately all 500 were tested again, resulting in the increased positive test results. The Post said in its statement this weekend. Soldiers familiar with a life at the beginning of a transition from being a civilian to being a soldier know that upon arrival at the airport in St. Louis, going to Fort Leonard Wood, these young recruits are going to find a cadre of drill sergeants waiting with a bus to take them on the 2-hour drive to Fort Leonard Wood. They are not hopping in a cab or calling an Uber, definitely not walking, but are under military control, positive military control as soon as they arrive in the airport. That bus is going to take them to 148 Reception Battalion, normally, but now is being routed over to the Harper In-Processing Health Screening Facility, where they will grab their gear, sign in, be issued some linen and assigned to a bunk, and will not go to the post exchange, the commissary, the movies, or even the closest town, even before the newly implemented monitoring procedures begin. Describing the new regimen in place on installations like Fort Leonard Wood, GoArmy.com, the official Army recruiting website, states, before training begins, all recruits are first screened and tested for COVID-19 at the Harper In-Processing Screening Clinic. Each trainee has his or her temperature checked and are asked if they have any symptoms or have been in close contact with someone diagnosed with COVID-19 in the last 2 weeks, said Major Amy Rice, Fort Leonard Wood Public Health Emergency Officer. Whether or not they report symptoms, all trainees are also tested for COVID-19 with a nasal swab when they arrive. Rice said trainees who test positive for the virus, show COVID-19 symptoms, or have had close contact with the virus within 2 weeks are separated and placed into isolation or quarantine barracks. She added that the Preventive Medicine Division completes contact tracing for all trainees who test positive for the virus. During this investigation, close contacts will be identified and appropriately placed in isolation or quarantine, depending on if they have symptoms or not, she said. After screening, recruits without recent contact or symptoms are transported to their training units via sterilized buses to begin the 2-week controlled monitoring phase. According to Major Zebulon Pike, 3rd Battalion, 10th Infantry Regiment Executive Officer, every day during those 2 weeks begins with a health screening. Both trainees and drill sergeants wear masks, and the barracks are separated to minimize foot traffic in all areas of the building. We will continue with the controlled monitoring phase to minimize potential cross-contamination, keeping our new trainees in platoon-sized bays with platoon integrity throughout the phase, he said. Training taking place during the first 2 weeks includes much of the academic training curriculum. We are facilitating increased focus on customs and courtesies, ethics, law of land warfare, wear and appearance of the uniform, physical readiness, training philosophy, recovery, and fueling for performance, Pike said. No time ever goes to waste here. The end result is always to have a better prepared and more capable soldier that immediately makes a positive impact to their first unit of assignment. After the 2-week period of platoon integrity, the trainees will go to the 43rd Adjutant General Reception Battalion for 3 days and receive a general orientation that includes ID card issue, dental and vision exams, and uniform issue. This helps protect the workforce at the reception battalion and reduces risk to all involved during reception activities, according to officials. Pike said the remaining 8 weeks of BCT looked almost identical to the way it did before. So if you thought you were restricted and in quarantine before a pandemic crisis when beginning the military, being told when to go to sleep at lights out, when to wake up at first call, when to report to formations and be routed quickly in and out from military dining facilities with not enough time to taste your meal, that does not compare to the new protocol. And on day 0 of a 14-day monitoring phase, not even one new recruit tested positive at Fort Leonard Wood. They secured the hatch for 14 days, creating a sterile cohort of soldiers with platoon integrity, endured 4 days processing under maximum positive control since arrival from the airport, and at the point at which soldiers were beginning basic training in assignments to training companies downrange, separate training companies downrange, as they say, infections that may take 4 to 5 days to appear, or up to 11.5, suddenly erupted in an outbreak, indicating that either an undetectable infection entered the sterile bubble created for the monitoring period and developed during the course of monitoring for 14 days, or suddenly arose during the brief period in the reception battalion or in the training company, which would have required an almost instantaneous escalation, shorter than the 4 to 5 days from the incubation period to onset of symptomatic presentation. Problematic for this scenario is that there is no report of correlated infection amongst cadre and other supporting Army civilians who may have introduced the pathogen to the sterilized cohort of military recruits. And according to the Army Times, officials at Fort Benning ran into a similar issue. About 640 soldiers and trainees assigned to the 30th AG Battalion and 2nd Battalion 29th Infantry Regiment were initially screened and tested by medical professionals at the beginning of their 14-day monitoring period. All but 4 test results came back negative. Those 4 individuals were isolated and have since recovered and received negative test results, according to Fort Benning, consistent with 85% of COVID cases. However, others there later caught the virus. 8 days after the end of the group's controlled monitoring phase, a trainee reported to his unit leadership with symptoms, and immediately all 640 across the 2 units were tested again. The Fort Benning statement reads, of those tested, 142 of 640 had positive results. 640 initial entry infantry soldiers who went through a 14-day monitoring period, through a 4-day time in the reception battalion, assigned to different training companies downrange, and 142 had positive results, indicating that we would have to have done something that we have not seen inside our current threat model. How could all but 4 of the military's youngest recruits contract a novel coronavirus just days before reporting for basic training? Generally unaffected by reopening of bars by age, restaurants and businesses currently being blamed for the rise in infections across the nation, which puzzlingly have begun to erupt in communities like Yakima, where units with missions oriented at the combat in the Pacific Theater train, and in Texas, where Reserve and National Guard component soldiers happen to mobilize. How 8 days after being assigned to a training company where soldiers emerging from a sterilized bubble under constant positive control of their every activity are tested every day, did 142, over half the size of a training company, and dispersed to one of several training companies, test positive for infection with no corresponding infections amongst cadre and Army civilian staff. Perhaps a sleeper virus that remains undetectable for longer periods than has been reported, indicating that perhaps the model has to be amended, perhaps. But over 20 anomalies to date regarding a novel coronavirus, including the failures of the American patient zero to infect even one from 68 tracer contacts with whom he came in contact over a period of 4 days, including a 20-hour flight from Wuhan and a shared Uber ride that traveled at least 25 miles from SeaTac Airport in Washington to Snohomish County, as well as the ability of a novel coronavirus to avoid the top 15 destinations from Wuhan, to deploy in highest incidence to South Korea, the avowed enemy of the People's Republic of China, and the ability of novel coronavirus to bypass Hawaii with a 4.2% Chinese American population during Chinese New Year, and avoid Los Angeles and San Francisco en route to the United States in sufficient mass to set off statewide infections, can ironically be explained by only one unifying reason: a novel coronavirus being deployed, not spread, as a biological pathogen for tactical or strategic reasons in the form of an aerosol. A theory proposed to Senator Mark Warner in late March, as well as to the World Health Organization, but about which neither has to date returned a reply. While Governor Ralph Northam, the nation's only physician serving as a state governor and former Army surgeon who admits he knows nothing about biological warfare, has continued to evade service of process for a civil complaint by the Sheriff's Department for the city of Alexandria to answer these questions since April 2nd, 2020. An action regarding the masking requirement was filed in Richmond just before Independence Day, and if Governor Northam wishes to continue to obstruct justice by evading service of a summons, he will have to avoid service of process by the United States Marshal. Bottom line, either the current threat model for guidance on how a novel coronavirus spreads needs substantial revision, or the one threat model that has explained every anomaly to date, over 20, is the correct one. America is under attack, and at some point in the future, we may wake up surprised. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress with liberty, honor, and excellence. By God, we shall make America great again. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.